So, today we're going to dive into the systemic issues behind Japan's escalating child abuse crisis. We're going to look at the numbers, some of the events from 2025, and really try to understand a story that's, well, it's a lot bigger than what you see in the newspaper headlines. Okay. Let's get into it. Our story really starts with a tragedy. Let's go back to June 2025. 3-month-old baby boy is brought into a hospital in Osaka and he's pronounced dead. The doctors, they see signs of severe head trauma, what they identify as the shaken baby syndrome. And they do exactly what they're supposed to do. They immediately call in the authorities. And this one single absolutely devastating case, it really opens the door to a much bigger national crisis. Yeah, because the thing is, what happened in Osaka, sadly, it's not an isolated incident. Not by a long shot. To really get a sense of the scale here, you have to have a look at the national data. From the year before, and honestly, it paints a pretty alarming picture. 2,649. Just let that number sink in for a second. That's how many child abuse cases the police in Japan handled in 2024. Not only was that an all-time record, and it was the 11% jump from the year before, a huge increase. And behind those cases, 2,700 children, another tragic record. You know, it's easy just to see a number, but every single one of those digits is a young life turned upside down by violence or neglect. And then there's this number, 52. That's the hardest one to talk about. That's how many children died from abuse in 2024. It nearly doubled from the year before. So this crisis isn't just growing, it's getting more and more lethal. So you might be wondering, what kind of abuse are we actually talking about here? Well, this chart's from Japan's Child Guidance Center is really revealing. You think physical abuse would be number one, and it's a huge problem. Don't get me wrong. But look at this. Almost 60% of all consultations are for psychological abuse. And a huge part of that is kids who are forced to watch domestic violence happen right in their own homes. Okay, so the numbers paint this really clear and frankly pretty terrifying picture. So the next logical question is, what's the system actually set up to do about it? You know, how does the law even define this stuff? And how is it supposed to deal with it? So yeah, it's a really fundamental question, right? What legally counts as child abuse in Japan? The country's Child Abuse Prevention Act is actually very specific about this. So the law breaks it down into 4 clear types. You've got physical abuse, sexual abuse, psychological abuse, and neglect. We're not just talking about hitting a child here. Back in 2020, they passed an amendment that banned all forms of corporal punishment, even if it's for discipline. So what's the first line of defence? Well, the system's main tool for getting involved is actually really simple, but it's powerful. It's the 3-digit hotline, 189. It's open 24/7, you can call anonymously, and it puts you straight through to your local child protection centre. And here's the critical part. In Japan, every single citizen has a legal duty to report if they suspect a child is being abused. And that's for the foreigners too. Okay, so there's a hotline and people are legally required to report. But what happens after the call is made? This is where the story gets way more complicated. It starts to reveal these deep, deep cracks in the justice system and in how these tragedies get talked about in public. You hear this phrase a lot when you look into this. Prosecution is just the tip of the iceberg. And it's so key to understanding what's really going on here. It points to this massive, massive gap between how many kids are suffering and how many of the people responsible actually face any legal consequences. Just look at this gap. I mean, it tells the entire story, right? Here, in 2024, you had over 122,000 calls and notifications about suspected abuse. 122,000, and from all that, how many cases did the police actually open? A little over 2,600. And the number that actually ended up with someone being convicted, that's a tiny, tiny fraction of that. The justice system barely even scratches the surface. And of course, the way we all understand this crisis is shaped so heavily by the media. You see a pretty clear split. On one side, you have the conservative papers like Yomiuri and Sankei. They tend to frame these stories about individual bad actors, about moral failure. But then you have the more liberal outlets like the Asahi and the Mainichi, and they tend to zoom out and look at the bigger picture. Things like social isolation, money problems, and lack of support systems for families. And there's this one really critical blind spot in a lot of the media coverage that analysts call the invisible father narrative. Basically, even though we know from the stats that fathers are involved in a huge number of these cases, the media spotlight often lands almost entirely on the mother. And what that does is creates this really skewed public perception, and it makes it harder to develop policies that actually address what's going on. It's with the entire family. Now, this idea of violence being normalised, it's not just happening inside the home. It actually extends to another huge part of a child's life, where historically it's been rampant and even culturally accepted. And that's the world of youth sport. Listen to this quote. It's from a Human Rights Watch report from a Japanese athlete talking about their coach. I was hit so many times I could not count. I mean, that's just one of the countless stories like it, but it captures this brutal everyday reality of physical abuse being passed off as coaching. This practice has a name. It's called taibatsu, which means corporal punishment. And it's rooted in this old belief that you have to be harsh, you have to be brutal to forge champions. But let's be really clear about what we're talking about here. We are talking about coaches punching, kicking, and hitting children with objects. And even with all that cultural history behind it, it's completely 100% illegal. Since 1983, 121 is the number of children in Japan who've been killed while playing judo. Just think about that. It's a horrifying statistic that you just don't see in any other developed country. And it's a direct result of physical abuse being disguised as tough training. So let's pull all this together. You have a crisis with numbers that are just climbing and climbing. You have a justice system that can't possibly keep up. And you have these deep cultural issues in places like sports. Japan's entire approach to protecting children is really at a critical crossroads right now. So what's the way forward? Well, experts and advocates are calling for a fundamental paradigm shift. They argue that Japan has to move away from a system that just reacts after a tragedy has already happened and move towards one that's all about prevention. What does that look like? It means creating an independent body to investigate abuse claims and maybe, most importantly, building real, robust support systems to help vulnerable families before they ever reach a crisis point. And all of this really leaves us with one final crucial question. Gets to the very heart of the challenge, not just for Japan, but for any society trying to protect the most vulnerable members. Can a system that's designed to react to a tragedy, to punish after the fact, can it ever truly prevent crisis? That's the core question that has to be answered if things are ever going to change.